Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archives to Earbuds, podcast for cultural institutions. I'm Jeremy Helton, a podcast audience development consultant and the coordinator of the Archives to Earbuds discussion series. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and I'd also like to thank the Leo Baeck Institute for making this discussion series possible. And before I introduce our moderator and panelists, I just want to share a quick message from the Podcast Academy, the co-presenter of this event. The Podcast Academy invite you to join their diverse network of over 1,000 podcast professionals across the globe who are shaping the podcast industry. Now through November 14th, the AMBIes, TPA's yearly awards ceremony for exceptional podcasts, are open for submissions. TPA members have special member pricing and can engage in the voting process. Visit TPA online to learn about other member benefits like their mentorship program and events like these. Now, as cultural institutions consider new ways to engage patrons and better serve new and diverse communities and populations, podcasts emerge as an exciting tool for such engagement. But there's a steep learning curve for institutions when it comes to cost of both producing podcasts and developing audiences for them. Our moderator and panelists will share their insights and expertise on the challenges and opportunities of podcasting and how podcasts can serve the missions and programming needs of organizations in an increasingly competitive attention economy. So without further ado, our moderator is Jessica Alpert, co-founder and CEO of Rococo Punch, an audio content creation company that specializes in premium audio storytelling for a wide range of audiences, including the original series, The Turning, Welcome to Provincetown, and Queen of Hearts. In 2023, Rococo Punch launched RP Labs, a vertical dedicated to audio innovation within education with clients in healthcare, tech, and higher education. Allison Goldberg is a senior consultant, email and digital marketing at Capacity Interactive, the premier digital marketing consulting firm for culture and the arts. The folks at Capacity Interactive have their own podcast, See Eye to Eye, which is tailor-made for arts administrators. And several of Capacity Interactive's clients have their own podcasts, including the Seattle Opera, the Joyce Theater, Court Theater, Dorset Theater Festival, and Carnegie Hall. Christine Ragasa is the founder of Christine Ragasa Global, a communications and marketing firm. She brings over 20 years of PR experience in fields of entertainment, lifestyle, health and wellness, media, news, publishing, business, sports, and technology. Some of the audio companies she has worked with include Rococo Punch, Gilded Audio, Pushkin Industries, Topic Studios, Entropy Media, and Night Vale Presents. Next up is Manda Martin, who has worked with nonprofit cultural organizations for the past 15 years in roles spanning production, administration, external relations, fundraising, and strategic consulting. Manda has led a wide range of creative projects in collaboration with both institutions and individual artists, and has previously held leadership roles at La Placa Cohen, Space on Ryder Farm, The Team, and Culture Project. Rachel King is co-founder and CEO of Pod People, a content and marketing studio for award-winning podcasts and social creative, working with clients like HBO, Netflix, Vogue, and Bon Appetit. Recent history and education-related podcasts produced by Pod People include Untextbooked, a podcast for the History Collab, in which teenagers interview leading historians, and Changing Course from Teach for America. And last but not least, Stuart Cox is the founder and president of Antica Productions, a Toronto-based production studio that produces nonfiction podcasts, films, and series for a variety of clients, including the Aga Khan Museum of Islamic Art, Audible, the Canadian Museum of History, Thomas Reuters Foundation, and the Leo Baeck Institute, with which Antica produces the podcast Exile, narrated by award-winning screen and stage actor Mandy Patinkin, and LBI Presents, hosted by author and journalist Mark Oppenheimer. Jessica, Allison, Christine, Manda, Rachel, and Stuart, we are so happy to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Wow, what an incredible panel that we are having here today. Hi, everyone. I want to thank Jeremy again for pulling us together and allowing us to have this conversation. I'm really excited to chat with you. And just a little bit of lay of the land, we're going to chat. And then about 15 minutes before we close, we're going to open it up to questions. So again, encourage you to upvote so I can see the most popular questions. So another thing I want to say is I have organized this tentatively into 3 Ps, this conversation. So we have perspective, people, and production. And I love alliteration, can you tell? So we're going to start with perspective, because there are a lot of you out there who represent cultural or educational institutions. And I think that you have a unique set of goals and circumstances. And so I want to start there. And I'm going to start with Manda Martin. So Manda, I'd love you to talk to us about barriers to engagement for cultural institutions, and specifically how podcasting may or may not fit into programming.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to draw on some of my work from La Placa Cohen with an acknowledgement that there's a bit of time stamping on the data that I'm going to cite, but I think there's still plenty of relevance and insights that are germane to this conversation. I think bear considering. So at La Placa Cohen, we did a large-scale research survey called Culture Track. I'll make sure that that link is available to everybody afterwards, in which we surveyed 125,000 Americans in 2020 and again in 2021. The goals were broad for that survey. It was really thinking about what is the impact and experience of the pandemic on people's lives right now, and again, kind of a year into the pandemic, and more specifically, what are they needing, wanting, desiring from cultural organizations, from cultural participation, and how has that changed when we were largely in a remote-only context, and then as we began opening up. And so again, a very particular and specific period of time, but I think there were some real insights coming out of the profusion of experimentation with digital formats that I think are still instructive. So of those 125,000 Americans, we asked a lot about digital participation. Obviously, we really wanted to understand what people were doing, what was successful. Were there any, initial ROIs that could be pointed to, and how cultural organizations were experimenting with different platforms. So I think germane to this question of barriers, we saw across the board, across any cultural entity type. So a symphony versus an art museum versus a historic site. The first time digital visitors, so folks who had not engaged with that kind of cultural entity in the past prior to engaging digitally. Across the board, that number was at least 40%, and in some cases went as high as 75% for, I have not been to X kind of cultural organization, but I'm testing it out in a digital mode, which I think spoke to the fact that audiences were experimenting as much as cultural organizations were experimenting with how they were participating and what they were offering. Now, that was a broad range of different kinds of digital participation, but over the course of those two studies, we also saw that podcasting went from the 5th most popular form of digital engagement to the 2nd by 2021. So I think that points to a couple of really tremendous opportunities coming out of all of the ways that our language and vocabulary for what we can do culturally and the ways that we participate culturally changed because of that tremendous social and cultural behavior change. And so I think when we looked also across the who those new users were, it was exactly what cultural organizations have been talking about for certainly the entirety of my career, which is diversifying and expanding audiences. All of those new visitors were tremendously diverse across every demographic category you can think of: race, ethnicity, household income, educational background. And so I think that points to both the opportunity that exists for this medium to really help engage new and different audiences, but it also points to the barriers that have been in place for a long time for a lot of people. And those are both social and logistical. That's what we saw both in the quantitative data as well as in the qualitative, what people, when we gave them the chance to talk about what they were enjoying, why they liked digital activities, it was because they didn't have to worry about whether or not it was a place they were welcome. They didn't have to worry about what they were wearing and if that was going to be appropriate. They didn't have to worry about whether they would feel safe in that space. They didn't have to worry about what time the thing was offered in some cases. So we saw both for physical accessibility, for time accessibility, for geographic accessibility, digital engagement strategies really do open up a pool of audience that I think cultural organizations have been trying to figure out how to tap into for a long time prior to the pandemic. And so I think podcasting, to my mind, is really exciting, because how often are you in somebody's ear that's visiting your cultural entity for 30 minutes, for 60 minutes, for 90 minutes, telling them a really good story about your organization? So I think that the opportunity is tremendous. The barriers are very real and haven't changed, by the way, since the pandemic. Those are still, you're still competing for people's time. You're still competing for whether or not they live in the same place as you, if you are, a four-walled institution, which so many cultural organizations are. And you're still, we're still working to embrace a historical understanding of cultural organizations as being for everybody and not for a particular class or kind of person. So I think podcasting and the storytelling that's available through the intimacy of the format is a really tremendous opportunity for cultural organizations to transcend those barriers, geographic, social, logistical.
Thank you, Amanda. And I think you're going to point to some of your reports below, so people can dig in a little bit more. But so we talk about cultural institutions hopefully being available, more and more available to everyone. But I'm going to go to Allison Goldberg right now, because at the same time, I feel like it's really important for institutions, at least initially internally, to be aligned about who that audience for that podcast should be. And if it can't be, for everyone, well, then let's all be on the same page. So Allison, why don't you tell us a little bit about audience and how you think about it, and how you imagine marketing and programming meet?
Absolutely. I obviously, we want the most people possible to listen to our podcast, but that is not really a reasonable goal. That's not really a measurable goal. So we talk to a lot of our clients about, with all of their content, how can we really be user focused and what is the benefit to the user? So I think that's what we want to think about when it comes to podcasts is Seth Godin, so marketer, is sort of like a patron saint of CI. And he talks a lot about the minimum viable audience. And I know minimum is a scary word, but I think that audience is generally a lot bigger than we might think it is. But thinking about who that audience is allows us to make something like a podcast or an exhibition or whatever that's a lot more unique and a lot more useful to the people we're trying to reach. So if the goal is to reach sort of more diverse audiences who may be not as familiar with our organizations or our work, then maybe it's more of like a 101 type piece of content, a podcast that then could be used across different, make a video of it and put that in a social post or something like that to get further use about that. Or if it's something really specific to the people who are really loyal patrons, if you're a theater and you make a podcast that's a interview with a director or the playwright for someone to listen to, like on the way to or on the way home from seeing a production, other people can certainly discover it, but it's really to deepen the work, the relationship of the audience with the work. But it really is it is another mode of programming. It's another place to come up with content. Of course, there's this idea that we're getting in people's ears. And so it's also this marketing opportunity, but there's also marketing that has to happen for the podcast itself.
That's so key. And I think when I think about marketing, I also think about PR. And Christine Ragasa, there's something about, the care and feeding of current patrons and supporters, right? We want them to feel heard and seen. But then if there's a shift in desire to reach new audiences, right? People who may not be engaged currently with the institution, how do you reconcile that? How do you begin to counsel cultural institutions when it comes to thinking about reaching audience, both new and established?
Well, first off, a big shout out to Jeremy because we have 86 participants at this event, and I think it's an incredible showing, given that we're, busy and bombarded, left and right with tasks. To answer your question, Jessica, I highly recommend clients think about audience while coming up with the podcast idea. I think audio networks, podcasters are investing a lot of money up front, and they're not thinking about who the audience is and what they're doing on a daily basis, what their likes are. So, oftentimes I meet with potential clients and they don't have an idea of who that person is, or segmenting who the market is, what the audience is and how to market to those people. The other thing to think about PR wise is why the subject matter and why now? What is this podcast saying about this cultural moment or this moment in time? It's helpful PR wise when pitching a host to speak on a topic that might be in the news or that might be relevant to what's happening. The other thing for the clients to think about is who the host is. Is the host someone who is uniquely qualified to speak on this subject? Especially for PR, you want someone who is in that sort of industry, maybe doing work behind the scenes. I've worked with many reputable journalists who are experienced, have a long history in a subject matter. I've also worked with audio networks where they hire a host or they onboard a host, and that host hasn't actually worked in that field for more than 10 years. And so that's a bit of a challenge. I highly recommend podcasters to think about the lead time, PR wise, and marketing wise, we need a longer lead time in order to pitch stories, in order to pitch other podcast shows, to get people to pay attention, to get buy-in. We have the relationships, but it's not a one and done deal. We have to basically convince them, and there's a lot happening in the world, right? I think cultural institutions are competing with other forms of entertainment, whether it's documentaries, films, obviously other podcast shows, books, and whatever else is going on in the news. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, I think that's perfect. I want to add one thing about hosts. So I know that cultural institutions have to do a little dance of diplomacy, right? Or a lot of people do, around like, well, who should be the host and who needs to be the host? And I just think that people need to go in with their eyes open when it comes around to hosting. If it's going to be someone who's less experienced and maybe less dynamic, plan for that. Really help that person come alive, whether with a coach or just help them feel comfortable in the chair. But then also think about how you're going to reach audience if the person is a little bit less known or less dynamic. So just something to be aware of, some truth serum. So I want to turn, thank you, Christine. I want to turn to Stuart because we're at the moment now that we want to talk about production. And the reason we're doing this a little bit later in the conversation is because I wanted everyone to feel grounded in sort of the issues that we're facing or issues that our panelists believe we're looking at when it comes to developing an idea. But we have to talk about executing it. And so I created this is a list that I created. It is by no means an exhaustive list, but Stuart, I'm hoping, can walk us through them, because I find when talking to clients for the first time, there's a lack of shared definitions around what these shows are and what they sound like. So I'm going to hand it over, Stuart, to you to talk about the different types of shows that are available.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And just so interesting to hear actual data that confirmed my intuition about a lot of this stuff up to this point. I think that, often when we sit down, I mean, I was saying to the panelists before we went live that I kind of stumbled into working with cultural institutions. I came from sort of a more mainstream entertainment background, but I always felt that cultural institutions had more of a bandwidth problem than anything else. It was just hard for them to reach people. And, you think about museums, they'll often have, over the course of a decade, millions of people walk through their doors, but they don't have the same cultural weight sometimes outside of their geography. And in a lot of the conversations, it does come down to, well, what are the stories? You have depth and authenticity. What's the best way to get that across? And we do some of these shows actually for some of our clients right now. So I guess a chatcast interview show would be a good place to start, because that's probably 98% of most podcasts when people think about it. I would agree with what was said about you need to have a host that lives it. And I often, when I'm talking to people about podcasting, and I say, like, look at the top 100 shows in the US. Most of them are actually not from big media companies. Most of the legacy superstars are people who were just enthusiasts who started podcasts. It's very hard to put a star into a chat interview show about a subject they don't care about and get an audience. People want depth and authenticity, and people want niche. I mean, back to that point as well about, I love that idea of a minimal viable audience, because, a lot of, again, look at the top 100 shows in the United States at any one point. There are a lot of what would seem to be kind of niche topics. I mean, but if they're really well done, a lot of people gain an interest in it. And, so I think when you're composing a chatcast or interview show, to think about someone who has a lifelong interest and depth, maybe is on a bit of a crusade around that subject, if I can use that word in a kind of a non-religious sense. I mean, in reality television, the reason that Jamie Oliver or Gordon Ramsay work is they actually are real chefs, and they really want clean kitchens. And they want you to eat healthy, sustainable food. And I think, whatever your cultural institution is about, to find someone with that depth, that's really important. And, narrative nonfiction is probably the ideal form. I think it's the sort of the HBO premium that people want. It's expensive. It's difficult to do. I know that the show that we do with the LBI, working with the curators, translating from other languages, it's about a year to get an episode together and through. And obviously there are lots of other things too, if you're dealing with a high level institution, to make sure that, you've consulted with communities, that everything is, reflective of the truth, that how these families feel comfortable with it, how academics feel comfortable with it. And then you sort of want to make it exciting. You're trying to make because you are competing with all those other things people are talking about, everything from Game of Thrones to, Minecraft. And, I think narrative nonfiction, if you can afford to do it on some fashion, is what audiences love. I mean, it's sort of, it's got the level of cliffhangers. It's got the level of episodic depth, sound design, storytelling that is exceptional. There aren't a lot of fiction. There's not a lot of fiction done in the cultural space. I mean, there is, obviously, if you work at, a theater company, there's an interesting opportunity. There've been interesting examples of people taking particularly stuff from stage and doing adaptations of work for audio. The jury is still a little bit out, to be honest, whether you can find an audience. And I would say, unless you are a performing arts institution, probably want to stay away from fiction. It's complicated and difficult. We have a company in the UK, and there is a tradition of listening to serialized fiction on British radio, and we get commissions still. We just do a commission now for a situation comedy for radio from the BBC. But there's an audience baked in for that. It's more difficult. There have been some successes, obviously, but I think with limited budgets, I would probably stay away from fiction. I think recorded live events should be sort of part of your bread and butter. If you're a cultural institution, you're often probably already having these talks. And I often think about touch points with the consumer. If, whether you're running a museum or a university or a performing arts space, having a talk. We do talks at the National Arts Center in Ottawa, for example, that about politics. but it's a chance to get people in the room at the National Arts Center. It's the national capital, so they like having people in there. It's a way of also just living your brand and becoming a bit of a verb, whatever you are. And usually with the clients we work with, there is so much incredible material they haven't even thought about packaging. It's also very inexpensive because you're already probably bringing in some of the smartest people in the world in your area to do that. Single voice conversations, absolutely doable. I'd say where it gets harder to do, I mean, you think about sort of the granddaddy of some of these things, like say a Dan Carlin with Hardcore History. It is an incredible amount of prep and work, and to be that level of speaker and really control week by week. Again, if there's an exceptional talent there, you should do it. And I think for each organization, I would say you should probably do an audit on who do you have in your relationships that, and there may well be someone who could lean on all of these one thing or another. And I think it's often with that kind of conversation around what kind of resources you have, the kind of people you have, some of these forms will become a little bit more apparent. I mean, with the LBI, I'll make one last comment. A lot of their material is in German. So there was a lot of material that had not been heard in English before. So there's an interesting opportunity to speak to an English audience. And so that leaned us more towards the narrative nonfiction, but we also do a chat show for them now too. So we do both. That's sort of a little bit of an overview.
That's great, Stuart. Well, you mentioned cost briefly, but I think that's always at the top of people's minds, resources and costs. And I do think that those different categories can be dramatically different. How do you, without going into specific numbers, probably, which is impossible, how do you explain to prospective clients how to manage cost?
And I think most people who run podcast companies would say most of their calls with prospective clients end with, you should just go do it yourself. Like if you don't have any money and you maybe have someone smart in your, anyone can record a podcast. I've got a little microphone plugged into my laptop. I can tell you which model this is. I mean, you can go do that. I think what you're paying professionals to come in to do is all the things that all the people have skill sets here on the calls. It's like understanding your audience. It's forming the relationships. We do shows for clients that end up on NPR. There's a level of high level quality you have to have in there. I think that often people are spending, like, you can also think about podcasts as donor development. And that's many of our shows are funded by new dollars that come in. And often we find once we start a show, more new dollars come in. Back to Amanda, your point about diversity. People hadn't really thought about something come in, and it's everything from Kickstarter to Patreon. People will put money into shows that they love. And so if you're lucky enough to be an organization that has a bit of budget and has a bit of a long-term plan for donor development, the investment may well be worth it. Also, you could spend a lot of money at a museum and not guarantee, back to the point being made about, I can guarantee, like, for Exile, we hit our first 100,000 downloads for that show. Roughly speaking, that's like 80,000 half hours of listening for the LBI. And if you've been to the Jewish Museum of History, it doesn't often get that many people through their exhibits, it's engaged. So if your organization can value that kind of engagement, it may be better than spending your money on other things. And the other great thing about audio, I'll cede the floor, is just that you can record now in a format that'll probably sound pretty good 25 years from now. We're not going to get stale data. There's an archival aspect to it that is very powerful. And the long tail, if you can commit to publishing for a long time, we have some shows that have been running now for 3, 4, 5 years for some of these institutions. And people, once they discover it, will go back and listen to the whole thing and form a relationship with the institution that's different. Now, that money was spent in fiscal year 2017, but it's now, unlike an exhibit that would maybe down and maybe like a Festschrift or whatever that is, been remaindered at a bookshop, people will still be listening to it. So I think that it's difficult to do the business case unless you have some money, but if you have some money, it's probably a better delivery than where you're investing some of your other money, is my own feeling. And certainly many of our cultural clients, we've only had, I think, one drop off after one season. Like, it was interesting how many it's built over time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the one thing I would add is, and this is a great segue to Rachel, is that building audience takes time. Just as you all know, getting people in the door takes time and takes effort. So we're going to come back to Stuart in a bit, but Rachel, I want to go to you and talk about now. Okay, we've talked about pinpointing our audience. We've talked about where we want to find people and thinking about our audience before we even start writing. We've talked about production, but once we have the thing, how do we make sure that people hear it? And what do you say to clients throughout the process in terms of how do we plan?
Yeah. So I would actually back up and say, before you make the thing, marketing starts at development. At least for us, our marketing team is present at every developmental workshop, every client kickoff, because every single piece of the show is marketing, is potentially marketing if you make it shareable. And obviously the first and most important thing is that you tell the story in the best way possible. But as we're crafting it, can we think about the title? Can we think about the descriptions? Can we think about the categories this is going to fit in? The show artwork, the social, obviously, even the segments of your show. Can you have a segment of the show that's super shareable or super clippable or gamified? Your hosts are obviously potential marketing. Your guests are maybe the most obvious marketing because they literally have communities of people that they're going to share it out to. And even like a tight edit is marketing, because if someone gets through your episode and they're still jazzed about it at the end as they were at the beginning, they're much more likely to share that episode because they didn't get lost in between or trail off. So that, I think, is the most important to think about. The marketing starts at development. It starts in the very, very, very beginning. Ideally, obviously we come on to projects sometimes where we're later in stage, but since, most of the folks on this call potentially are making their own thing or about to launch, that's the gospel that I want to share on that front. And then, so how to make it easy to get folks to share it, right? Because podcasts are, it's an RSS feed. Someone has to click that little share icon and decide to text it or to tweet it. It's not as easy as, say, sharing an Instagram reel. So how can we make it easier? Creating resources for your guests, I think, is the low-hanging fruit. Also, if you have a newsletter, and you should, that is so much easier for folks to share and to forward to a friend. And you're collecting their email addresses so that you have two ways of getting in touch with them. Maybe they fall out of listening for a while, but they're still scanning their email, or vice versa. So when you have something new, you have more touch points, and they're more in your world, a little more in your world. And I would also, a tactic that I love is when hosts that I listen to don't just ask you to leave a review, but they give you a specific question and ask you to answer it. Las Culturistas does this all the time. And I'm I've already left you guys a review, but I'll go back and change it just to tell you what the Katie said this week, So I think that's a really cute way, because sometimes it's just the prompt, you don't know what to say in a review. But if you ask someone specifically to answer a question, even if it's just, what do you love about the show, or what do you wish we did more of, then you're actually getting feedback as well as a review, which obviously helps with, getting it surfaced when folks are scanning through what they're going to listen to. And then on social, obviously promoting the hell out of it, especially in that first 72 hours after the episode goes live. But I also love the idea of running a raffle, not a cheesy one, but something with merch or something related to the show. For your true fans, if they share, those can work well on social. Obviously, it has to be done in a way that feels organic to your brand, and it might be different for different organizations, what you feel comfortable with. But finding a way with an incentive for folks to share on social, give them a reason to share the post, and tell them how, make it easy. I think that's really helpful.
And Rachel, do you think it's important for people to develop new social assets, or should they leverage what they already have? Is there a separation of church and state? What's your thinking on that?
You mean assets, not different social handles, right? For the podcast?
Well, no, it could be social handles too. I often see people saying, well, we got to start a whole new thing. You know, we got to start a whole new Instagram page.
I think if your organization does not have enough buy-in to the podcast that they're not willing to put it on main, you shouldn't be doing the podcast.
Wow. Yes.
I also would strongly advise against creating you have a whole audience already built in. So why not?
But templates, yes. I think having templates that are related to your brand, but incorporate the podcast that you can use across your different channels. Absolutely.
And can you point to someone who's doing it really well? So if cultural institutions want to try to DIY it and really learn from people.
Yes, but it's going to be one of our clients. I'm so sorry, just because they're top of mind. But we don't create their social. They do. So I'm not taking credit for this. But we make schmaltzy for the Jewish Food Society. And I think they do a really, really good job with the clips. I also think Untextbooked, which Jeremy mentions, I believe we do make their social assets. I should know that. But it's either way, they're really good. I think they do a really good job. And I love the branding of that show. So I apologize for listing our own examples, but I think they do a great job.
No apologies necessary. We have a few more minutes before we hit questions. So I want to open it up to the panelists to add anything they think I should have hit on previously, or something they want to even talk about when it comes to marketing. The one thing I'll add is that the whole idea that if you make it, they will come is beyond wrong and false. I used to hear that in public radio all the time. And maybe if you have like an established audience, but not really. So I always say to people, yes, think about your content, but think about your audience and how you're going to get them there. So that's really, really important. They should not be divorced. They should be married at the very beginning and in a relationship. So anyone else before we go to, we have like a few more minutes.
I do have a list of, I asked my marketing team to give me like their 6 top tips / tactics for current day, because obviously it changes literally every day. But here are the 6 things that they would tell anyone who is trying to market a podcast right now. Think through the channels. This is low hanging fruit, but think through the channels that you're already organically reaching with your audience, and obviously leverage those first. That's a no-brainer. But also think through where your target audience currently is in terms of other communities like Reddit threads, newsletters, and if you can, partner with or even run an ad on those organizations' communities. Keep a list of the podcast platform's monthly editorial priorities. For example, in February might be Black History Month, if that's relevant to your organization. March, Women's History Month. These are obviously very macro examples, but if there are other holidays or timely events, elections, etc., you want to launch your episodes to the most relevant month, or time your like tentpole episodes around those, and then pitch the out of them, because Apple and Spotify always have editorial collections around these things that you can pitch yourself for and get into, which is great. We love some earned media. We love some things that we don't even need to pay for. If you do have budget for paid, we recommend spending on products or ads that will specifically help you chart on Apple, because that leads to much more organic discoverability than other platforms. At least today, that may change, but as of right now. And one hot tip that I think everyone on this panel knows, and probably a lot of the podcast folks have found out the hard way: social is for awareness, not downloads. It is not going to generate downloads one-to-one. At least you're not going to be able to track it that way. But for people to see a clip, become engaged, love your content, engage with it, and it puts a bug in their mind. So the next time they do see it, or someone sends them an episode, they're like, oh, right, I've been meaning to listen to that. And then they actually do. So it is helpful. But if you don't see that one-to-one from social to download, that's why finally leveraging your owned channels and your personal networks. Email colleagues with a personal note, post on LinkedIn, promote on your own newsletters. And if you can send them copy or those template of social things that we were talking about, make it super easy for them. And always be like, absolutely no pressure. But if you enjoy this, if you want to share, that it really does go a long way, especially in the beginning, because you kind of have to get to that critical mass before organic word of mouth can really take off. So in that beginning, like getting from 0 to 100 listeners is a big deal, and it's a lot of work, and then it gets easier and easier. So yeah, blast it to your LinkedIn.
Yeah, this is not the time to be meek and mild.
Yeah.
And I think that this all may sound very overwhelming for a lot of folks, but just take it one step at a time. And there are a lot of people like us that can help, but then there are other institutions who are doing it, who might be helpful as well.
And Jessica, you should plug for the fact that you're doing free consulting according to your LinkedIn post.
Oh, I did.
Oh, you did
That
already?
in 30 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Occasionally, follow me on LinkedIn or LinkedIn me, because every few months I do a free consulting session. Like I'll open up 15, 20-minute sessions to talk about anything you want. So it keeps me on my toes, and I love hearing people's ideas. So the last thing I'll say before we go to questions is to remember that when you hire someone for production help, you are not necessarily hiring them for marketing help. That might be a separate line item. Now, some production companies do it all, but some really don't. So it's a good question to ask when going in. And often production companies, even like us, we will recommend people all the time that we suggest you work with when it comes to audience development and PR. So, okay. I'm gonna move to questions. So we have from Q Smith. Does anyone on this panel know any statistics on whether the tone of someone's voice contributes to podcast success? And if so, are people using vocal coaches to expound on their craft? I think this is a good one, folks. Anyone want to chime in?
We hire coaches all the time.
We do. At Rococo Punch, one of our producers is a host whisperer. So that's what we call him. He has worked with every type of host, from experienced to not experienced. And it can sometimes take time. I think the key is to make sure your host is willing to learn and listen. And if you look at reviews of any show, honestly, people have opinions about hosts, and you don't have a ton of time. You don't want to ruin that first impression that you have with a monotone host, for example. Anyone else want to chime in about the host? No. Okay. Next, from Jacob. Stuart's point about podcasts as fundraising / membership opportunity is a great one, but it also raises the question of how to get everyone in an organization, from creative to communications to development to leadership, on board with the initiative while not having too many cooks in the kitchen. What are your experiences in navigating this process?
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you'd go. This was to you.
I was just gonna say, the truth is that you've got your donors and then you've got your future donors. So, and I think you've got they're all the parts of the sales funnel for an organization, and each one is different. What I have found, and I'll just be quite blunt about this, is that the people who can write, 6-figure checks are kind of what you want today, but you want them down the road 3 to 5 years as well. I think that it all comes, an organization who can figure out podcasting, it's almost like one of those external figures of health. Like, if they can figure out podcasting and messaging, they're probably going to be good at the donor experience. They're probably going to be good at their marketing. All the other things are going to be fine. So those organizations that we've worked with that had a harder time, they had other issues. They had other things at the organization. So, I mean, again, we're just a podcast company, so I can't really say this. All I can say is that if you've got a pretty functional organization, we can help you brand your, the public face, create events, dinners, bring in celebrities, all the things that can actually close some deals over the next couple of years and make it exciting. I have a number of the institutions we work with, people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s have been very pleased that their grandchildren now understand the organization and have heard, engaged with the content more because of the podcast. I mean, it's not all about elderly donors, and it's about many other things, but it is fundamentally about that kind of internal health of the organization and you being a capper. You can't go in and solve the other stuff, but boy, if everything is functioning and there's a clear ask for donors, you can be a rocket fuel.
I was also gonna say, like, as Rachel was saying, like, social is not going to be one-to-one with downloads. Like, podcast listens is not going to be one-to-one with donations or attendance, but it is that awareness, and it's just growing, just an additional touch point, and growing that awareness to build that audience over time. But I think most importantly, you need like programming and marketing to be agreed upon it, and they can sort of help convince leadership and go up the chain.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say that I think if it's clear kind of that the podcast is a program in the way that an exhibition would be a program, in the way that kind of any other offer that the organization would create in real life, in situ, in their cultural institution, then it should be, those lines of ownership should be clearer. And any smart development team is going to know how to leverage an incredible asset, whether it's an exhibition, whether it's a podcast.
It could also
Can I
fall.
add one other, sorry,
go
can I
ahead.
add one other thing is, for cultural institutions, I think they should also think about the calendar of events that are happening in a given year and where the podcast fits into the overall schedule. You know, obviously the Met has the big Met Gala that gets a lot of attention with Condé Nast and a Wintour involved. They have the big exhibit with Manet and Degas that's, you know, starting soon or is happening in a couple weeks. And, you know, figuring out where the podcast fits into all of this, because you know, those are big events where there's going to be a ton of attention, and then setting aside PR and a marketing budget, and utilizing that, because we are competing with so many things that are happening, you know, on a daily basis.
And just from a super practical standpoint, so once you've decided, to Stuart's point, that this is worth pursuing, we really try to manage, because usually we're working with one point of contact that we're going to be working with on the podcast forever. And then to whoever asked that question, to your point, there are a lot of other people who want to be involved. So from the very beginning, messaging, we are so excited to have you involved in the development for the first few meetings, and you can give specific parameters, and they are welcome and invited to give feedback on that first episode. And then the blueprint will be locked in, and then their contributions are no longer needed. And you say it more diplomatically, but you give them a very clear timeline for all the other stakeholders that they are invited, and we're excited to have you contribute in this first stage. And then you're very busy and important, so you need to go back to doing everything else that you're doing. We got it from here.
I love that. I'm gonna combine two questions, or because I think they're related. So Jill is asking about discovery, and that is like everyone's word these days. Like, is there a particular place where people, you know, really focus in terms of getting their podcast discovered? And I want to combine that with a question about video podcasts from Marion, because, you know, I think they go hand in hand when it comes to discovery. Is video now absolutely necessary? How does everyone feel about video, and then also discovery? I can start. We are now doing video as part of all of our podcasts, and we do use video for social, and we use video to engage certain listeners on YouTube. Now, again, this is about audience and understanding where they are. It goes back to what Allison was talking about, what Rachel was talking about, Christine and Manda. Like, what are we thinking about when we want to reach certain people, and where are they? Are they listening only to video? I mean, these are the things that we have to think about. Anyone else have words of wisdom around discovery?
I would just say on just one last thing on the video, I think it comes down to your KPIs. And for those producers out there, or for those people inside institution have to justify the investment, do video, because you get a lot more than you get for downloads. Count your social as part of it. Think about your podcast as kind of the narrative tentpole for everything. That's the way that I tend to conceive it. It's the deepest engagement, likely. Although obviously people who are listening on podcasts on YouTube, it's part of a different behavior, I think. The only challenge is you're going to have to up your budget, because I think most people who are of a certain level want a really good looking shot on their video. And so there's an extra level of concern and production and attentiveness to make sure that the video works. But the video sliced into smaller chunks is great for discoverability on your social. And I would include that in your total KPIs, because you can get great 30-second clips off a podcast that'll be great on lots of shorter Instagram or TikTok, and can potentially reach entirely different audiences.
I would also add that not to put the onus on one thing only and one thing. Like, for example, I worked on the Modern Love podcast, the first iteration for the New York Times, and we thought, oh, it's going to get huge because the actors are going to tweet about it. And yeah, they often tweeted once. Okay, that's lovely. That's not going to build audience. Okay, so I think, yes, that again and again and again is helpful, but it's key to just keep all the channels open and to think as widely as possible. I think, looking at time, I think let's talk about funding. So there are a lot of questions around grants, how, there's another question around like sponsoring a narrative nonfiction show. If a cultural institution funds a separate show, do any of you have expertise in that area? Allison, Manda, maybe in the grant space or thinking about funding creatively?
I don't have direct experience, but what comes to mind is Carnegie Hall is one of my clients, and they just launched a podcast this fall I was not involved in, called Great Music Teaching, I believe is what it's called. And it's a short, like 6-part series that clearly furthers their mission about making music education accessible across the country. And it was specifically for educators. And our team did help them market it to try and reach those, that educator audience. So like, I think there's certainly some creativity there in terms of like, this is a digital way that we are really pushing and achieving our mission of furthering music education across the country and giving music educators tools and resources.
I would just say we have a full-time grant writer, because we realized if you don't have one, you're not going to get the money. Like it's not just identifying the grant, it's working with the grantees over often 6 to 9 to 12 months to identify the programming. And often the cultural organizations don't have the time or the effort to do that long lift. Because basically, if you're a program maker, you're probably going to take most, if not all, that money for yourself. So they're like, well, it's great for us, but if you want to do the work, if anyone's sort of interested offline, I could probably post some of the resources that we look to. What I find is that we're at a moment now where you can go to the kind of organizations who would fund cultural organizations and say, this is about brand building. So this is a different kind of investment. A couple of organizations, well, many of them actually over the last 5-6 years, it's the first grant they ever got for podcasting. But like, it was new money coming in for podcasting to build their brand, to become 21st century organizations. And it's a kind of an onerous, kind of awful process. And frankly, you have to think like a sort of a Soviet apparatchik some of the time to like work inside these organizations, but it does pay off.
Yeah, I'll just upvote what Allison said. I think if the connection to the mission, the connection to the purpose, the fundamental why of the organization, if that is crystal clear in why you are doing this podcast, why it's an extension of the larger organization, then that shouldn't, I would say, for a funder that you want to be involved with in launching a new entity, I think that shouldn't be a hard sell. I think funders are getting a lot more savvy to the challenges facing cultural organizations, to the very, very wide toolbox that cultural organizations have at play in terms of digital methods of engagement. And so I think as long as you can argue the case persuasively about why, to Christine's point, like why this subject matter, why now, everyone is trying to make their content, everyone's trying to make their archives relevant to contemporary audiences. And so if you can prove that you're going to do that through this medium, then why wouldn't that be as fundable as an exhibition, as a series of workshops, as anything else you'd be offering?
I feel like that's a perfect segue to talk about archives and oral history. And we have a few questions about primary source material and how do we treat oral histories if we want to try and use them within a podcast. And I want to open that up. I will say that in my experience, I started in this industry in oral history, and I think oral historians are treasures, and a lot of these archives are incredible. But two things to think about. Number one, it still has to be entertainment, and that is not a bad word, but it does. So when you think about using oral history, it has to be presented in a way that's still exciting and interesting. And the second thing is audio quality. We can do a lot now with cleaning up audio quality, but some things are very difficult to repair. So those are the only two things I'll say. Anyone else want to talk about oral history?
I'd also add that I was shocked that many museums don't actually have the right to broadcast their archives. So you have to go through a special clearance process, and it's not assumed, even if it's from 70 years ago, that it's available for the museum to use. So it's another thing to add to your E&O insurance if you're an outside production company, that someone may sue you, and you have to just kind of bite the bullet and say, I'm going to use it anyway.
Anyone else about oral history? I will say, I feel like there's an earned press opportunity, if I may say so, Christine, who is the expert on all things press. But I think institutions really leaning on primary source material, if it's possible, is a great story.
Yeah, I mean, I think never before heard material is incredible for a producer, for a print journalist, digital journalist, especially including those clips. And then if we pitch it as an exclusive somewhere, I think people would be chomping at the bit.
We're at time, folks. I hope we tried to hit most of your questions. You feel free to reach out to me and the panelists. I want to thank everyone for being here. What an awesome conversation. And again, thanks to the Podcast Academy, to Leo Baeck Institute, and Jeremy for facilitating. So we hope you found this helpful, and we hope this is just the beginning of your podcast exploration process.